Hey guys, this is your second lecture, big lecture on American Lit. This covers Unit 2. That's the period between 1914 and 1945, and that's our kind of like second big unit in the chapter, or in our textbook, which I believe begins on page, begins on page 667. I think it's about the shortest unit in our textbook. It has the shortest amount of readings, and I think it's also kind of like the shortest time span, because really we're just talking about that period between World War I and the end of World War II, which includes the Great Depression. Just a quick disclaimer, this lecture is just designed to help you better understand the concepts in the textbook. As far as the quiz is concerned, I will probably answer a good amount of questions that are on the quiz by just having you listen to this lecture. However, I won't answer all the questions that are on the quiz, so make sure that before you take the quiz or as you're taking the quiz, you're also reading the chapter content in the textbook. And just as another reminder, you have the whole entire span of Unit 2 to complete this quiz. So it will be open this week all the way through the end of Unit 2, which I believe, let's see, I think it's like around week 10 or 11, something like that. I'm not exactly sure off the top of my head, so check the course calendar for details. Okay, so I've kind of just organized these slides based on the main headers within the chapter. The first part of the chapter kind of gives us the historical context for the time period. So before, in 1914, World War I begins. Before that, the United States has kind of made a lot of advancements. We're having a ton of city growth with immigrant populations coming to the U.S. We're still in a situation before the war where there's plenty of small towns, plenty of, kind of spread out people, but our big cities are growing. There's a new network of railroads. Automobile is becoming a consumer good, which means it's not just for rich people anymore. More middle-class people are able to purchase a car and learn how to drive it, and so it's really becoming something that everybody has. We're starting to envision highways. Highways are going to become like a symbol of the United States. And then, of course, if you have taken any North Carolina history, you know that the Wright brothers had their first successful flight in 1903. So we've got a lot, like leading up to World War I, the United States has made a lot of advancements to be a modern country in the 20th century. We begin 1914 with World War I. The U.S. doesn't enter World War I until 1917. Right before that, around 1916, and this is not just in 1916, this spans for a couple of decades, we get the Great Migration. So that's millions of Black Americans are leaving the segregated South. Our book mentions the Great Migration just a little bit, but I do have a supplemental link here in the PowerPoint. If you guys want to read more about the Great Migration, there's a history.com link that talks about, that move from the South to the North, and that it kind of helps fuel later things like the Harlem Renaissance, where we have big cities in the North, or big, suburbs and places in the North where you're looking at like all Black areas and, making music and doing art and writing poetry and novels and stories and things like that. Then in 1920, we get the 19th Amendment, which gives women, mostly white women, the right to vote. Now, that amendment did give some Black women the right to vote, but voting still had stipulations. So there were still things you couldn't do. If you couldn't do them, you couldn't vote. Or if you didn't meet a qualification, you couldn't vote. And it was mostly white women who met that qualification. So even though there were Black women who could vote with the 19th Amendment right away in 1920, we still really are catering mostly to white women. And if you're interested in reading more about that, you can read more about that here. Again, our book doesn't necessarily cover this, but I think it's important to kind of keep in mind. In 1929, the stock market crashes. There's a 25% unemployment rate, and our book kind of talks about how that's an even more significant devastation than we would think of today, because women really weren't working that much. So it's like 25% of men workers, and then you have to think about the fact that I'm not just men, but if you're thinking about it in that way, most women were not working. So they're not working, and then 25% of houses had no one working, if you want to think about it like that. That's not to say that no women were working, but most women weren't working. Which that leads into the economic depression, which we know as the Great Depression. The effects of war, of course there were negative effects, but our book does mention some positive effects. The country becomes unified politically. It revitalized industry, and it put people to work, because when the men go to war, women have to pick up the slack, and a lot of women started to work during wartime, and then when people were coming back from war, when people were coming back from World War I think partly that leads to the Great Depression, because there are so many people looking for work, but I think probably after World War II, and you guys might need to check with your history instructors actually about this, but after World War II, there are more kind of working opportunities, especially as we're looking at these advancements with railroads and automobiles and airplanes and city growth. There's more opportunities for work. Finally, World War II is ended in August 1945, and so that's why we get our time frame that we're looking at right now. Between 1914 and 1945, our textbook is specifically situating these as the war years, and in between the war years, the beginning of World War I to the end of World War II and everything in between. That's what we're reading about. Really, we're covering a lot of modernism. Modernism, in a vague sense, can be referred to as these years of literature, but even more so in a more specific way. Really, modernism is international. It's an international movement. It's a challenge mounted against traditional authority. So and we're talking about across disciplines. So in almost every realm: art, religion, science, politics, social conventions. If we're talking about challenging traditional authority in art, that means who were the art authority, what was the authority on art? What was that traditional painting style? Well, now painters are going to start challenging that, and you're going to see, like Cubism and Dadaism and things that are kind of like challenging or questioning, like, does art have to look the way that it's always looked for it to be considered good art? We're challenging traditional authority in religion. People are questioning Christianity. What is real? What is truth? There's a question of, is Christianity just a way to make sense of the world? There's more questions about that. People are questioning traditional authority on science. We're learning new information about science, and we're also questioning that new information at the same time. People are questioning politics. We're going to see a rise in Marxist and communist thinking during this period, questioning the politics of capitalism. And people are also questioning and challenging social conventions. So what has traditionally been socially acceptable, people are trying to challenge that and make more things socially acceptable. There's three key issues, and these are particularly with kind of like our area of study in literature and the humanities. One of that is a question and a challenge of the literary tradition. And there's three questions about this. One of them is, are new works kind of paying homage or giving honor to the literary tradition? Are they just imitating an old fashioned? Like, do we need new things? Or if you fail to honor the literary tradition, does that mean the new writing is bad? This modern writing is terrible because it's not doing what was tradition in literature? Or should we recognize literary tradition but in an ironic or deliberately fracturing way, which means that we're going to bring up parts of literary tradition but not the whole. We're just going to give you glimpses and make you fill in the pieces in order to like make you do the work or participate in the writing of the story. So you're going to see a lot of that in the texts that we're reading in this period. Another key issue is with the idea of pop culture. Jazz and film, for example, there was sort of a debate about pop culture. Should it be embraced? Or was it just cynical commercialism? Like, pop culture is lowbrow literature. Pop culture is film. Pop culture is not traditional music. It's new music, like jazz. So should we embrace it, or are we just thinking like, you know, pop culture is for people who aren't educated in the traditions of literature and of music and of art and things like that. And then of course we have key issue with art and social politics. Should art and literature get involved in society and social issues in politics? And there's a debate, you know, on, okay, well maybe you must get involved. Maybe it's your role as a writer to get involved. Maybe if you don't get involved, you're seen as someone who just is wanting the status quo and doesn't want to shake things up. Maybe you're seen as kind of a coward or afraid. Or maybe art for art's sake, regardless of politics, regardless of what's going on in society, write good art, or make good art, write good literature, and it really doesn't matter if you get involved. So there's these kind of questions and debates and different circles and camps of thinkers, and you know, what do they think about, and how do they believe we should handle tradition and pop culture and politics in terms of literature. And you know, we have this section on changing times. We're getting a lot of change during 1914 and 1945. Like we mentioned before, there's a call for bigger boundaries of what's socially acceptable in terms of self-expression. We get Sigmund Freud, who invented psychoanalysis, where he makes the case for tracing society's repression of the self. Essentially what that means is that Freud says you can tell a lot about a person by the things that they're repressing. And if a person is allowed to just be themselves and not repress whatever they're repressing, then they will like be a better version of themselves, and they'll have peace and balance. I think that's like a very postmodern way to think about it, but that's kind of the concept here with Freud. And so psychoanalysis comes in to say, let's look at your manifest content, like what you're saying, what you're writing, what you're doing, what you're dreaming, what you're thinking, in order to understand the latent content, which is the repressed stuff. So if these, you know, Sigmund Freud and dream studies is really kind of one of his key books, The Interpretation of Dreams. He's meeting with people and asking them, you know, describe your dream to me. And he's asking them questions about their dream. And in doing that, he's figuring out, okay, well, this dream interpretation is probably, here's what you're repressing. And of course, Sigmund Freud had some really like key themes that you would hear come up, and we have heard about them, you know, Freudian slips and Oedipal complexes and things like that. And that all is traced back to psychoanalysis. Women, in terms of changing times, women are demanding a more equal status to men, sexually, with their education, with the work that they're allowed to do, with their mobility, where they can move, where they can go, and even with their clothing. Women want less restrictive clothing. Like I mentioned before, the Great Migration leads more African Americans to the north, particularly in Harlem, which leads to the Harlem Renaissance. There was a debate in the Black community which sparked from the Harlem Renaissance. Should African Americans claim membership in the culture at large or stake out a separate artistic domain? So, or do both. You know, there's kind of this, like what our book calls a double consciousness of being American and also being African American, being Black in America. Like, what is that? How is that different from being white in America? And I think that, you know, these questions arise and we see them come up in the literature of this time, particularly from our Black authors. Marxist thinking becomes more mainstream. Marxism is complicated, but essentially it's the idea that whatever the dominant class is, whoever is the dominant group of people in a society, will always control what's important and what matters. And Marx identifies these two classes, the bourgeois and the proletariat. The bourgeois is like the owners, the people who own the companies and who make the rules and who have more wealth, versus the proletariat, which is the working class. Marxism is basically more power for the working class in this early 20th century thinking. There were also, our book mentions 2 highly publicized criminal trials, which questions the fairness of our judicial system for both people who have un-American thinking, like communist thinkers, or people who are following Marxism, or even people who are anarchists, people who just don't want the government at all, and also questioning the fairness of trials for African Americans in the South. And the book covers 2 mainstream kind of big trials. We get a short section on science and technology. We're getting pop culture brought to us through the phonograph, the record player, the motion picture, and the radio. The phonograph brings us music, same with record player, motion picture, obviously film, and then radio, like broadcasts and stories. A lot of literature is serialized at this point and can be told in sections over the radio. Also, the radio brings us news and information of the war, and it can help kind of like spread information, but especially pop culture in our case. Automobiles, and specifically the road, the image of a road itself, becomes symbols of the United States and of modernity. And you can think of that like that. I think that makes sense. You know, if you think about like Route 66, and just like if you've ever seen the show American Pickers, the idea of like being on the road and traveling to different places, like it feels like a very American idea. Which is not to say that other countries don't have roads, but it really, the highway becomes a symbol for the United States. New scientific information, and like our book goes into the specifics here about, you know, the atom not being the smallest particle, leads to this divide in science and humanities, because science is giving us research-based, testable proof and facts on, you know, the world around us. And I think a lot of writers, especially writers, which feels surprising when I read this, they you know, don't want science to necessarily be able to tell us these truths. There are other ways that they want to have these truths uncovered and figured out, like through psychoanalysis and things like that. So there's this kind of disconnect and battle or pull between science and the humanities, or our book calls the letters, because of really just different schools of thoughts on what is reality and how do we find reality. And even, you know, with this idea, like modernism, and I think we're going to get into this in the next slide or two, but modernism wants to really prioritize the subjective experience over the objective truth, like capital T truth. well, science could possibly offer us this objective, capital T, truth. And I think that modernist writers who want that subjectivity, they don't like the idea of that, or they're hesitant to want to like the idea of that. I think that hasn't probably changed. Our book covers the 1930s, which is really just the Great Depression. After the stock market crashes, we get more of a polarized United States. So when we're not in wartime, we're not so unified. Conservatives kind of suggest, let's wait until things get better. Radicals say, no, we need immediate social revolution, which leads to an increase in interest in the Communist Party because Tsarist Russia has just become the Soviet Union, and people are like, look how great communism is working in the Soviet Union. That is until, there are these, like, Stalin brutally murders plenty of people, which shocks Communist Party supporters in the US, and then they become these, like, avid anti-communist supporters after World War II, and realize how communism is not what they thought it was. Because let's see, I think I skipped a bullet, but basically that's the idea. The Soviet Union was used as an example of the benefits of communism until people saw what Stalin did and said, okay, this isn't what we thought communism would be. So their bubble was burst, I guess, if you want to think of it like that. We get some, like, American versions of modernism. Like I said before, modernism is an international idea. Modernism is taking hold in multiple countries, not just in the US. Our book labels modernism generally, and then more specifically, and I'm quoting here, as first, any kind of literary production in the interwar period that deals with the modern world, but more specifically, work that represents the transformation of traditional society under the pressures of modernity, and that breaks down traditional literary forms in doing so. And we talked about that before. We're not really looking at the things that made literature great in the 19th century. We're now questioning, we're now challenging in literature. Do we need this form in poetry? Does a poem have to follow this rhyme scheme or this pattern? Does it have to use this form of alliteration in order for it to be a good poem? Or can my poem be good on other non-traditional elements? Same with novels, same with short stories, same with plays, although and there is still a huge debate in this question. Should we teach work that isn't traditionally written? Because the camp or the thinking is that traditional forms of literary tradition, things that follow literary tradition, things that are included in the canon prior to modernism, are the best forms of writing, and shouldn't we be teaching the best writing? Now the world is asking, in this kind of interwar period, can writing do more than just offer aesthetic value? Can it, again, we get this question of, should literature get involved in politics? So still a big debate, still a huge debate. You can look up any interview with Harold Bloom and get his perspective. He likes literary tradition. But it's interesting to kind of think about. Our book also has this quote, which I kind of wanted to kind of go over and just pick apart and figure out. On 678, they write, "At the heart of the high modernist aesthetic lay the conviction that the previously sustaining structures of human life had been destroyed or shown up as falsehoods, or at best, arbitrary and fragile human constructions." Okay, so let's think about what does that mean. At the heart of the modern period, especially with high modern aesthetic, which our book covers in more detail, is the idea that, like, the previously sustaining structures, basically tradition, what all the ideas and the values that up until this point we had held true, have either been destroyed, like, oh, not true, has been shown to be false, also not true, or is really just something humans have constructed to like keep the status quo. Humans have constructed that to make sense of the world, but really those structures, what has been constructed, is really fragile. They can be broken down really easily when you start to attack them and challenge them and question those things. And so that is modernism. It's like, let's imagine what we think is true isn't true, or let's challenge what we think is true and see if we can find the hole in it, because there is probably a hole. It's probably arbitrary and it's probably fragile. We get a lot of disillusionment here. We are starting a lot of the texts that we're going to read from now on, even past 1945, give us this feeling of disillusionment. And that's why we're starting our unit with Robert Frost's Nothing Gold Can Stay, because I feel like it really covers the idea of disillusionment. But this quote here on page 678 is really kind of like an underlying concept of modernism. There are some characteristic forms of modernism that you'll notice in the texts that we're looking at. They might begin arbitrarily, like just completely randomly. There's not much exposition. It might be like an in medias res beginning where it just starts right smack dab in the middle of some kind of action or conversation. The text might advance without explanation. It might end without resolution. You might not get a happy ending. It might shift abruptly in perspective, going from one character to another really quickly. Faulkner does this often. It might shift in voice. It might shift in tone. It might be understated or ironic in its rhetoric. It's not going to tell you what it wants you to know. It's going to give you the opportunity to interpret. We're really, in modernism and postmodernism, we're really getting into your ability to analyze, because texts are going to make suggestions as opposed to outright assertions, and they're going to do that through symbols and images instead of statements. And these texts might be shocking or unsettling. So I think there's still some element of like naturalism that is going to carry over in some ways through the modern period. We're continuing this. This is our biggest section in the chapter. This is the idea here. Sorry, I'm going to go back a slide. This concept of modernism and modernist texts being constructed out of fragments, with what you see listed here, is the idea of fragmentation and causes novels and even poems to become shorter in length. So, because we're taking out a lot of that statement, because we're taking out a lot of, here's what I want you to know, reader, you're getting shorter content. Modernist texts are more likely going to be written in first person or third person limited, which means you only get, first person is like, I did this, I went here, I talked to this person, I. Third person is he or she, or, naming the character, or they. But limited means that you're only getting into the mind of one person. The alternative to third person limited is third person omniscient, which means you're getting into everybody's mind. The narrator understands how Jenny feels, and the narrator understands how Derek feels, and the narrator understands how John feels, and all of the different characters, if you're in omniscient. But if you're in limited, which is what modernism is going to take more often, you're talking about just understanding what Derek feels. No idea what anyone else feels. And the reason that modernist texts are going to do that is because they want to prioritize, or they want to give way to the concept that really, if you're going to have a real feeling in a real text, you're only going to be able, you only ever know in life how you feel. So a reader is really only ever going to know how one character feels. You're only going to get into the mind of one character, because it's impossible to be omniscient. And so modernist texts are going to convey that subjective reality rather than this myth of objective truth, that it's different for everyone and you're only going to see into one person's mind. We're still getting colloquialism and slang like we did in our realist, naturalist, regionalist writing, but it's in a little bit of a different way, because before, our book kind of mentions that slang and colloquialism was used maybe almost stereotypically, but now colloquialism and slang is going to be used more authentically and more genuinely. In this period, we're getting romance and adventure and historical novels and crime fiction and westerns, and I think, you know, our textbook talks about the difference between, like, again, we have this question of literature and highbrow literature and literary tradition versus pop culture. Pop culture is starting to be a thing now, where you can be an author who's living, who is being read by millions of people. Like, Hemingway was this way, Fitzgerald was this way, and a lot of people consider these authors to be sellouts because they are writing interesting texts that might not adhere to literary tradition but are selling because they're adventures, or they're romantic, or they're crime, or they're, you know, using that Western motifs. And so, yeah, again, we have this idea of serious literature versus pop culture. They're kind of like butting heads with each other. I think we've got two more slides here. Modernism Abroad and on Native Grounds just kind of talks about our expatriates. So many American writers became permanent expatriates. Some even renounced their American citizenship, like T.S. Eliot did. And then others maybe just traveled abroad for some time. Being an expatriate is basically like you're still an American citizen, but you're living overseas in a more permanent way. Like maybe you bought a house in London and you don't really, maybe you'll travel back to America, but you don't necessarily intend to stay or come back to America permanently. And then you have people who are just traveling abroad who might, you know, go for a couple of months in Paris, but they're going to come back to the US eventually. We're still getting a lot of elements of regionalism. I don't think that we will read Faulkner. I cannot remember. We'll have to check the course schedule. But Faulkner's novels are wonderful and give you, you know, intense depictions of the American South. They're challenging to read if you've never read Faulkner, but definitely worth it. And especially if you're going to go into literature studies in the future, try to take an, you know, Southern Gothic course if your university offers that, because you'll read Faulkner there. Also, during this time, African American writing and women's writing refused to be pushed aside, so we're getting a lot more popularized writing by African Americans and women. And then finally, we have modern literature on stage and screen. Obviously, theater is not new to the US. Theater is not new anywhere. Europe has had theater and plays. I mean, clearly we've got Shakespeare to kind of think of as some of the best literary tradition. And Broadway has been showcasing plays since the 19th century, but some new forms of theater are developing. We're getting domestic and social comedy and musical comedies. So musicals are not new, but we're getting more of them. And then comedy that talks about like just the domestic life. What's it like to, be a housewife? What's it like to be a salesman? What is life like here in just this domestic sphere, and almost in an ironic kind of way, and the same with society. And then of course the film industry is rising in this time period. So that pretty much covers our full chapter. Of course, like I said, there's way more details here. But hopefully this will help you better understand the content in the book, and then also will provide sort of a basis for your understanding for the texts as we read them throughout the next couple of weeks in this unit. Of course, as always, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to send me an email. Don't hesitate. I hope you guys are doing good, and just let me know if you need anything.